We are in the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time. So, our Old Testament reading is from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 18, verses 6 to 9. And then our responsorial psalm is Psalm 33, a psalm that we have visited many times in the past and are revisiting today. Our second reading is from Hebrews 11, 1 to 2, 8 to 19. And our gospel reading is Luke chapter 12, verses 32 to 48. Some place there's the option for a shorter reading, which is only verses 35 to 40. But those of you who follow along know that I never go with the shorter reading, because why? There's so much to unpack, it would be a waste. So anyway, we'll start off by praying Psalm 119 as is usual. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. With my whole heart I seek you, let me not wander from your commandments. I have stored up your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. Blessed are you, O Lord, teach me your statutes. With my lips I declare all the rules of your mouth. In the way of your testimonies I delight as much as in all riches. I'll meditate on your precepts and fix my eyes on your ways. I will delight in your statutes, I'll not forget your word. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was at the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. In the name of the Father, of the Son, of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I'm feeling good about this. Funny thing, I always feel anxiety just before we start these sorts of streams and recordings, but once I actually get into them, I find that the anxiety completely dissipates. So it's just a matter of actually getting the thing started. And when the thing starts, it kind of just runs itself. So I just need to get over that initial hurdle. So, anyway. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 18, verse 6 to 9. That night was made known beforehand to our fathers, so that they might rejoice in sure knowledge of the oaths in which they trusted. The deliverance of the righteous and the destruction of their enemies were expected by your people. For by the same means by which you punished our enemies, you called us to yourself and glorified us. For in secret, the holy children of good people offered sacrifices, and with one accord agreed to the divine law, that the saints would share alike the same things, both blessings and dangers, and already they were singing the praises of the fathers. So, this is the wisdom of Solomon. So, even though it's called the Wisdom of Solomon, I don't really know anyone who believes that Solomon directly penned any of it. That would be a little hard given that the book is written in Greek and Solomon was a Hebrew speaker. Probably what happened was Solomon spoke many wise sayings. In fact, the book of First Kings records him saying thousands of proverbs, which, if we took at face value, is more than would fit in Proverbs and wisdom put together. It's possible that many of those sayings circulated in oral form for many hundreds of years, might have been shaped slightly by the developing Israelite tradition. And then at some point, they were translated into Greek, and then they were put down in what we now know as the Wisdom of Solomon. But this chapter, sorry, I just remembered I forgot to put on the timer, so you guys get a little bit of free extra time for the Wisdom of Solomon. But this chapter that we're in, it's actually a discussion of the salvation history of Israel. Actually, the that goes as far back as I believe chapter 17, or even earlier than that. Actually, if you read the latter half of the Wisdom of Solomon, yeah, there's a really long section that talks about the history of Israel and how the story of Israel is meant to be a display of God's wisdom and something that future generations can learn from in terms of what God is like and how we're supposed to respond to God. This kind of reminds me of what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6, where he says, "These things took place as examples for us." Now, in context, St. Paul was talking about the mistakes that the ancient Israelites made so that we wouldn't repeat them. But here, it's more positive. These stories are being told so that we are made aware of God's goodness and that we can likewise have trust in God for his greatness. So, the immediate section that we are reading is about the early part of Exodus when the Israelites were slaves. So in verse 5 it says, when they had resolved to kill the infants of your holy ones, and one child had been exposed and rescued, you in punishment took away a multitude of their children, and you destroyed them altogether by a mighty flood. So it's referring to two things in Exodus. One is when Pharaoh tried to kill all the Hebrew males, and then it also refers to the 10th plague when all of the Egyptian firstborn were killed. In a sense, the final plague was a reversal of what had happened nearly 80 years before that. And then verse 6, it says, that night was made known beforehand to our fathers so that they might rejoice in sure knowledge of the oaths in which they trusted. So the Israelites trusted in God. They, even when they were in slavery, they never forgot about God. In fact, in Exodus chapter 2, it says in verses 23 and 24 and 25, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. While the Israelites were waiting to be delivered, God told them his plan. Like in Exodus chapter 12, it actually talks about the fact that the that they were told beforehand that what the final plague would be and how they would avoid being struck by it along with all of the Egyptians. So that's where you get the Passover. So the Passover is the feast by which they commemorate God passing over them with the 10th plague. You know, you have the sacrifice of the lambs to commemorate that. All right, so praise the Lord. The verbum is back. I just need to go navigate back to my screen. So this will take a while. There we go. So they rejoiced in sure knowledge of the oaths in which they trusted. So they knew that they would be delivered. So this is something that'll come up again when we get to Hebrews, the idea that faith and knowledge or faith and certainty are not against each other. Having faith doesn't mean that, oh, you know, I'm not sure, but I'm hoping for the best. That is a very modern and it's frankly unbiblical concept of faith. So it's good to know what the proper biblical definition of faith is. We're going to talk about that more when we get to the epistle reading later on. Now, in verse 7, it says, the deliverance of the righteous and the destruction of their enemies were expected by your people. So it's just reiterating what it says in the previous verse. The people knew that this would happen. They were not caught off guard. And they demonstrated their faith by obeying God and doing the things that God told them to do. In terms of putting the lamb's blood on their doorposts. So, from a Catholic perspective, this shows how faith and works operate as a unified whole. So the people had faith that God would deliver them. That faith is concretized, you could say, in the form of works. And the work in question here is the putting of the lamb's blood on the doorposts. It would have done the Israelites no good to say, I don't need to put lamb on the doorposts. I just trust God. Now, if you really trusted God, you'd do what he says. Now, in verse 8, it says, For by the same means by which you punished our enemies, you called us to yourself and glorified us. So this is one of those interesting paradoxes, which is that God glorifies himself and sanctifies his people by the same means by which he punishes those who disobey him or are hostile to him. So the Egyptians are a good example of this. Whatever plagues God placed upon the Egyptians punish simultaneously. It punishes them for their sins. It brings about the deliverance of the Israelites, and it demonstrates God's power and glory over against the Egyptian idols. So all three things are being accomplished all at once. Um, so there's a verse that talks about this in Exodus chapter 14, where God talks about getting glory over Pharaoh. There it is. In Exodus 14:17 and 18, it says, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I'll get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I've gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So God is saying that the hardening of the Egyptians' hearts is so that he may demonstrate his glory. When I have gotten glory over Pharaoh. So, in Hebrew, you have the word kavod, which literally means weightiness. So the idea is God is showing his majesty and his weightiness through the punishment of the Egyptians. This is, of course, in the context of the Red Sea and how Pharaoh's army was drowned in the Red Sea, but you can apply this to all of the other things that preceded it, including the plagues. Now in verse 9 it says, For in secret the holy children of good people offered sacrifices, and with one accord agreed to the divine law, that the saints would share alike the same things, both blessings and dangers, and already they were singing the praises of the fathers. So the sacrifice in question would, of course, be the Passover lambs that were slaughtered to put the blood on the doorposts. And then with one accord they agreed to the divine law, which refers to how they would later receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. Moses climbs the mountain, receives the law, and delivers it to the people. And the people agree to obey that law. And this is for the benefit of all of God's people, that the saints would share in the same things. So the saints in this context refers to that immediate generation as well as all the subsequent generations that would be inheritors of God's covenant promises and therefore would also be asked to be obedient to it. So every generation has the obligation to basically renew their covenant promises and remain faithful to it. That includes the new covenant. So I don't know how many of you guys have ever been to an Easter Vigil Mass, but when the converts are received in the church by baptism and confirmation, every other person along with them is asked to reaffirm their commitment to the truths of the faith as expressed in the Apostles' Creed, which is a great object lesson of what it means to, with one accord, agree to the divine law. So something to think about down the road when we reach Easter. In fact, this really should be an Easter reading. This would be an excellent reading for Easter. I don't know why it's not included in the Easter Vigil. Maybe someone should tell the Vatican to revise the lectionary and add this to the catena of Old Testament readings that we recite on that day. Anyway, let's go to Psalm 33 now. So Psalm 33 is one of those psalms that recurs multiple times in the lectionary. There's a few such psalms that occur. I remember, for example, during the Easter season, there's one particular psalm. I think it's 132 or 133, I don't remember, but it actually appears for multiple weeks during Easter, and because of that, you get to hear the same psalm repeatedly. But because of that, I'm going to necessarily be brief in my treatment of this psalm because, there's no need to repeat the same content all over again. So let's read it and then we'll just say a few brief words about it. Shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous. Praise befits the upright. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart is glad in him, because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you. So, one of the interesting things that I actually learned recently about Psalm 33 is that there are some scholars who believe that Psalm 33 and Psalm 32 were originally the same psalm. And one of the hints of that, well, there's two hints to that. One is the fact that Psalm 33 has no superscription. So you know how some psalms have like a little title on top of it? So Psalm 32 has a maskil of David. Psalm 33 doesn't have that. The other thing is that um, if you read the last verse of Psalm 32, it seems to almost blend seamlessly into the psalm that comes right after that. So, you know, the last verse of Psalm 32 says, Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. And then it goes into the next verse, 33:1. Shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous, praise befits the upright. So, I don't know if this is true or not. To me, it seems plausible. Um, I don't, but it doesn't seem like a slam dunk to me. So the most I would say to that theory is maybe, maybe that's the case, or maybe not. Maybe it just happens to look like they were that way. Maybe they were just placed that way because they happen to sound similar to each other. Um, Anyway, let's take a look at this. So we read the first verse. So shouting and praising are placed together. So there is, as I mentioned before, a concept called Hebrew parallelism, where in Hebrew poetry they would place lines next to each other, and the lines build on top of each other. And there are different forms of parallelism. There's what you call synonymous parallelism, where the two lines express the same idea just in different words. So this is an example of a synonymous parallelism. Actually, no, it's more of a synthetic parallelism, another type that I'll explain later. There's antithetical parallelism, where the two lines serve as antitheses for each other. So a good example of that is Psalm 1, where it says, Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. The but is how you know it's an antithetical parallelism. It's contrasting two different things with each other. And then you have what is known as synthetic parallelism, and that's what this is. A synthetic parallelism is when the second line builds on the first line. It expands the thought that is begun by the first line. So in verse 1 it says, Shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous. And then the second line says, Praise befits the upright. There's almost an implied because there. The righteous are to shout for joy because it is fitting for the upright to give praises to God. Now there is some synonymous. It's both synthetic and synonymous, because if you'll notice, the second line repeats thoughts from the first line in different words, whereas the first line talks about shouting for joy, the second line talks about praising. Um, and the first line talks about the righteous, and the second refers to the upright. And those are not two different categories; they are the same category. Um, just again with different words to describe them. Ranu tzadikim ba'adonai lisharim na'va tila. So ranu is to shout. Tehillah is praise. Tzadikim is the word for righteous, and then Yisharim is upright. So tzadikim and Yisharim are synonymous, as are the verbs ranan and the noun tehillah. And now the lectionary skips to verse 12. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. So praise psalms tend to have a universal component, God's greatness as displayed in creation and to all the nations. So, for example, Psalm 33 talks about the creation of the world and how God continually holds the world in existence. But then it skips to God showing his greatness through his covenant promises to his people. So this is specific to Israel now. So blessed is the Goy. So Ashrei Hagoy Asher Adonai Elohav Ha'am Bachar Lenachala Lo. So the word Goy is used. Interesting because people think Goy means Gentile, but Israel is called a Goy from time to time as well. And here is an example of that. Israel is called both a goy and an am. So those two words, they are slightly different from each other, but they are roughly synonymous. Just a little bit of a side trail in biblical semantics when we talk about synonymy. There is complete and incomplete synonymy. Incomplete synonymy is when two words are technically distinct from each other, but there's some overlap in meaning. Complete synonymy is when they're completely interchangeable. So, for example, the words big and the words large are completely synonymous because they can be used interchangeably in pretty much any context. Contrast that with the words run and jog. So not all forms of running are jogging, but jogging is a form of running. So anytime you jog, you are running, but not every time that you run, you're jogging. Goy is much more generic than am in that context. So Goy can refer to any old nation. It can refer to both Israel and the Gentiles. Is more specific. Whenever the Bible uses the word well, okay, I wouldn't say whenever, but most of the times when the Bible uses the word it refers specifically to God's covenant people. Which is usually Israel, although on rare occasions it's used of Gentiles in contexts where God talks about bringing the Gentiles to himself as well. So, there's that saying, Am Yisrael Chai, may the people of Israel live, which is kind of a Zionist slogan nowadays, but it's a biblical slogan as well if you use it in the context of biblical Israel, not the modern state, but that's a whole other pickle. And they are regarded as God's nachala, inheritance, which is a kind of an odd word when you think about it. Why would God inherit something? An inheritance, in when we use it, implies that it's being received from someone else, but that can't be the case here. I know some historical critics will try to argue that there was another God that's higher than Yahweh, and that other God gives Yahweh his parcel. But that's wrong. That is based on a misunderstanding of what inheriting means in biblical Hebrew. It could just mean that God sets apart a people for himself. So Yahweh created all the nations, and he providentially runs all their affairs, but he has a special place for Israel. They are his nachala. They're his covenant people. And in verse 18 and 19, it says, Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine. So, again, you have synonymous parallelisms, two pairs of synonymous parallelisms. God watches over those who fear and hope in him. Fear and hope are, once again, not two contrasting ideas. They are complementary ideas. You both fear God in the sense that you reverence him and you desire to obey him. And you hope in him because you believe that when he promises to watch over you and protect you, that he will not go back on his word. And that is based on his chesed, his loyal love. So chesed is the type of love that God bestows on his covenant people. Um, it has it's love with the connotation of loyalty. So God promises things to his people, and because God cannot lie, he will fulfill what he promises. Um, this involves delivering the righteous soul from death. Now, of course, in the original context that this psalm was written in, that refers to physical death from dangers such as foreign invasions, wild animals, diseases, famines, etc. But you can spiritualize it as well to deliverance from spiritual death, from separation from God in hell. And then it talks about keeping alive in famine. So that's a more specific form of deliverance. You can almost imagine how this psalm may have been written in the midst of a particularly severe famine, or maybe right after a particularly severe famine. David wrote this to talk about how God got them through that difficult time. Um, I think there might be some scholars who would posit that this is a harvest psalm. Um, I'm not sure about that, maybe. So verses 20 to 22 is the rub or the final conclusion of the psalm. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. So, in light of everything that has been said previously in the psalm, we trust in God. We wait upon God. We wait upon him because he is our help and our shield. So, La Adonai is Renu Magenenuhu. So, he is our Ezer. So, it's funny. That's the same word that God uses to refer to Eve in Genesis 2, verse 17, or 2:18, rather. It's not good that a man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. In the Hebrew, it's Ezer Kenegdo. So the woman is the Ezer in Genesis 2. And then in Psalm 33, God is the Ezer of his people. Um, Now, make of that whatever you will. Some feminists will take that a little too far and say, well, this means that there's no complementarity involved because God's not just a complement to his people. But again, words can vary in their meaning slightly as they're used in different contexts. The common meaning in both Psalm 33 and Genesis 2 is that the Ezer um, is basically supports the well-being of the one who is being helped. So just as the woman supports the well-being of her husband, God supports the well-being of his people. The word shield there connotes physical protection. So we all know how a shield works. You put it in front of you, it blocks enemy blows and enemy arrows. So God blocks those who attempt to harm his people. Verse 21, for our heart is glad in him because we trust in his holy name. So again, being glad and trusting are placed side by side. When you trust in someone who is trustworthy, that brings you peace of mind. And there is no one more trustworthy than God himself. Other people, you can trust in them, but they will not have a perfect track record. Sometimes they're going to fail you. They're going to disappoint you. God will never disappoint. That's why the one who trusts in him can be glad. And in the last verse, it says, let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you. So the psalmist ends by asking God to continually bestow his chesed upon them. And in return, the people will continue to cling to him. They'll continue to trust in him. Yahi chasdecha Adonai aleinu ka'asher yichalnu lach. So again, chesed is the main concept here. God bestows his chesed, and that chesed is what we rely upon. So now we get to the epistle reading. So we're actually making really good time. Praise the Lord for that. So we have a long epistle reading here. We also have a long gospel reading. So it's good that we're making good time so that we have more time to dedicate to talking about Hebrews 11 and Luke 20, Luke 12, both of which are very weighty passages. There is a lot here that we can talk about, but once again, we're going to try to stay in 20 minutes. So let's read Hebrews. By the way, there's two options here. It's either verses 1 and 2, 8 to 12, or it's verses 1 to 8 to 19. We're going to go with the long version, because why not? Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able even to raise him back from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So Hebrews 11 is all about faith. It's about the examples of faith that we find in the Old Testament and how we should be emulating them. So we'll start off by talking about what faith is. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So let's turn to the Greek here. So an interesting note here is that the word for assurance there is the word hypostasis. That's the word that later on gets used to describe the three persons of the Trinity, but it meant something slightly different in the first century. So an hypostasis is, it's like a realization or reality, according to Louw-Nida's lexicon. So it is the thing which faith anchors onto. So, faith always has an object. So here it talks about the fact that faith grasps onto a reality that is not necessarily seen. So it's interesting because it's based on conviction. So there is an idea here that faith goes along with certainty, which is kind of counterintuitive if you really think about it, because we think of faith as something we need when we're not sure or when we cannot know for sure. But here, we are told that we have faith in things that we are certain of or things that we have conviction of. So we can be certain of the things that we believe in. Now, certainty here doesn't mean certainty in the epistemic sense. So, for all the philosophers out there, they use certainty with a certain connotation. It's almost like mathematical certainty. We are certain of things. the same way we're certain that 1 plus 1 equals 2. But that's not the kind of certainty that Hebrews talks about. This is what you would call moral certainty. It's certainty of the heart. Um, it is, the ESV uses the word conviction here. You can see is the conviction of things not seen. I'm just curious, how do other translations render that word actually? So in the NRSV, it's also conviction. In the KJV, they use the word evidence of things not seen. So faith is evidence, according to that rendering. The New King James Version also uses evidence. The NIV uses assurance. So the NIV has an interesting one. Faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So assurance has a slightly different connotation than certainty. Assurance is something that comes from the heart. It's subjective in a sense because it doesn't necessarily tell you the quality of the thing that is being assured of. It tells you more about the mindset of the person being assured. And now the NABRI, which is what all of you US listeners are going to hear in your lectionary. Evidence, again. So evidence, assurance, conviction. So different ways of understanding that word. So the idea generally is that when you have faith in something, you have a firm resolve to hold on to the thing that you have faith in, even when it is something that you cannot see. And the reason why is because, as verse 2 says, by it the people of old received their commendation. This is before the Hebrews proceeds to list all the great examples of faith from the Hebrew Bible. Those people, um, by their faith, they receive commendation. They are approved. By it, the people of old are approved. So, God rubber stamps them as people that we can emulate. Now, I should add a caveat here that they were sinful human beings. They failed from time to time as well. You can think about David and his adultery, for example, or when Moses did not quite completely follow God's instructions, and that's why he never got into the Holy Land. So even the examples of faith fail from time to time. The fact that someone is called an example of faith doesn't mean that they were perfect. It means that despite their failures, they were still fundamentally oriented towards pleasing and obeying God. Think about all the great saints in history. Some of them were fantastic sinners. You have, for example, what was the name of that one saint? Saint Mary of Egypt. Okay, she was a prostitute before she was converted. But when she had her conversion experience, she became a great example of penitence. So Saint Mary of Egypt is actually the patron saint of penitence. So a saint is not someone who's perfect. They're someone who, despite their imperfections, is still fundamentally oriented towards pleasing God and living a holy life. And the Old Testament saints are held up in Hebrews as great examples of that. So now we go forward to verse 8, to the example of Abraham here. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to go to a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. So we don't know too much about Abraham's spiritual life before he went out into the promised land. So a lot of later Jewish traditions try to fill in those gaps. So, for example, in the book of Jubilees, it talks about how even before Abraham was called out to go to to go out from Ur to Canaan, he already was a zealous follower of God. He would break idols that other people worshipped in order to convince them the futility of idol worship. Uh, now, that is all, of course, apocryphal. The only thing we know for sure is what the book of Genesis tells us. And the book of Genesis tells us that at some point Abraham's life, when he was, I think, 70 years old, God called him out to leave his country. So we read about that in Genesis 12, 1 to 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I'll make of you a great nation. And I'll bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Yet this passage gets abused a lot these days by Christian Zionists because they think that the you here refers to the modern state of Israel. Of course, it has nothing to do with that. It refers to Abraham specifically and his family, and the fact that when they facilitate Abraham's journey to the promised land, they will be blessed. But if they hinder him, they will be cursed. And that Abraham himself is going to bless those people who help them. And also, of course, the ultimate fulfillment of this is Christ, because through Christ, all the families of the earth shall be blessed by faith in him. We should not make the mistake of thinking that this is primarily about a piece of land in the middle of the Middle East. Now, in verse 9, it says, by faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. So they lived in tents, which is something nomads did. In fact, it has been speculated that the word Hebrew from Ivri has the connotation of a wanderer. So there's actually some debate as to what the word Hebrew actually means. Now, Abram has an ancestor called Ever, or Eber. So it's sometimes speculated that an Ivri is like a descendant of Eber. Another possibility is, an Ivri is someone who crosses over. So he crossed the Euphrates River to get to the promised land. But another possibility is an Ivri is someone who wanders. So even though Ivri primarily means somewhat, so Avar means primarily to cross over, but can have the connotation of wandering around. So an Ivri can be a nomad. So Abraham is a Hebrew in the sense that he was a nomad. And his nomadism can be understood literally. He was literally a nomad, but he could also be understood as a spiritual nomad in the sense that he lived in a temporal land that is not his final home, because his final home is in heaven. So the author of Hebrews takes that physical nomadism and infers a spiritual nomadism from that. So he physically lived in the land of promise, but he did so as in a foreign land. It was foreign because the Canaanites still lived there and they still owned the place, but it was foreign in the sense that even though it was promised to Abraham, it's not his ultimate home. And verse 10 makes this clear. Or he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So ultimately, the home that they are looking forward to is not Jerusalem. It's not the earthly Jerusalem in any case, the heavenly one. Even back in pre-Christian Judaism, there was already this idea that the earthly Jerusalem was only a copy of a heavenly Jerusalem, something that Hebrews makes more explicit in chapter 12, and which the book of Revelation actually presents to us in the form of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22. So the city that God builds is the New Jerusalem, which we will all someday inherit if we remain faithful, as Revelation tells us. In verses 11 and 12, it says, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So it's funny because Uh, he was Abraham was already 75 years old when he left for the promised land. So he was already past childbearing age from the get-go. Now, they did live longer lifespans back then, but even then, that had its limits. So you can imagine that Sarai or Sarah was already postmenopausal. So they had trouble believing that they could have a son. In fact, Sarah laughs at the idea. So in Genesis 18, it says in verse 12, so Sarah laughed at herself, saying, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? And then verse 13 and 14, the Lord replies by saying, nothing's too hard for me. So they believe that God would follow through on their promises, even though it seemed incredible, because God could do anything. Verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Um, so they saw the things that they were to receive from afar and greeted it as exiles on the earth. This is the first hint that we get that the promised land that God is giving to them is not ultimately the land of Palestine, because it is something that uh, because they're exiles on the earth. How can you be an exile on the earth and yet have your hope set on a piece of that same earth? In verse 14, it says, for people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. Well, they kind of already were there. So didn't they already receive it in a sense? Now, in verse 15 and 16 will make it explicit. If they had been thinking of that land from which they'd gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. So it's definitely not Mesopotamia then. But but in verse 16, but as it is, they desire a better country that is a heavenly one. So that land in question is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared for them a city. There is no way on earth you can connect that to that piece of real estate in Palestine. You know, people make a big deal out of it, but if we're gonna understand the land from from a new covenant context, that land was always meant to be a signpost, a type that points forward to something greater than itself. And when people get fixated on the Holy Land, they miss the point that God is only used that land as a signpost or as a type to point forward to the heavenly city, which is what our real goal is supposed to be. Which is why Christian Zionism is such a pernicious heresy, by the way, because it takes spiritual heavenly promises and then replaces them with earthly promises. It's like you're taking something great and glorious and you're substituting it with something lesser than itself. You know, why would you settle for the lesser thing when God is promising you the greater thing? Now in verse 17, it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his only son. Now, wait a minute, you might ask. What do you mean his only son? Didn't he also have Ishmael? By this time, Ishmael and Hagar had already been removed from the household. They've gone to the wilderness of Paran, which is roughly coterminous with Midian. It's roughly where the border of Jordan and Saudi Arabia is. So I know some Muslims think that it's Mecca in the Hijaz, but really it's further north than that. It's more like Nabatea or the Jordan desert. Petra is there for reference. So Isaac was the only son in the sense that he's the only son that actually receives the covenant promises. And at this point, he really was the only son in the household. Verse 18 says, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So Abraham has seen God at work. He has received God's promise of a son. So he knows that God can do anything, even give him a child in old age. So he must have believed that Somehow, even though he's about to offer up his son on the altar, he will still receive that son back. In verse 19, it says, He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So Abraham must have believed that, oh, even if I kill my son, God will just bring him back to life. You know, you get a hint of this in Genesis 22, by the way. In verse 5, then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. So in the Hebrew, it's made explicit that Abraham expected both of them to come back. Ve'ani ve'hana'ar nilcha ad ko v'anishtachave v'nashuva alechem. So every verb in that clause is in the first person plural, which means both of them will go, both of them will worship, and both of them will come again. So Abraham had full faith that whatever happens up on that mountain, Isaac will come down with him. And then it says, he did receive him back from the dead, figuratively speaking. Of course, that comes not in the sense of a literal resurrection, but in the sense that the ram is offered up in the place of Isaac. God never intended for Isaac to be sacrificed. The idea all along was for the sacrifice to stop in the last minute. And Abraham proved his faith up on that mountain. So the book of James also points to the same instance as Abraham being justified by works. So James asks, was Abraham not justified by works when he offered up his son on the altar? So it's both an example of faith and works. He had faith in God's promises, and he concretized that faith through the good work of obeying God. So those two, once again, go together. Now, almost 20 minutes. Let's go to the gospel reading now. The gospel acclamation is from Matthew 24. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Notice that the acclamation is from Matthew, but the actual reading is from Luke. So almost everything in our gospel reading is going to be something that is paralleled in the Gospel of Matthew in a slightly different context. So make note of that. So our gospel reading actually overlaps with both the Sermon on the Mount and the Olivet Discourse. And a lot of critical scholars use this to argue that that Matthew's presentation of events is artificial. He's just rearranging things. A more plausible explanation is that Jesus repeated the same stuff in multiple contexts. Have you ever had a parish priest deliver multiple homilies where he says the same thing each time? I know I have. Most Catholics don't notice because they don't pay attention during the homily, or they forget right away. But if you actually take the time to pay attention to the homilies and remember what's being said, maybe by writing it down or something, you know for a fact that your priest is recycling material all the time. And I expect nothing less from Jesus, who is the greatest homilist. He will repeat the same things multiple times because he's speaking to different audiences, but also because repetition is how you learn things. So let's read the Gospel of Luke, shall we? Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give it to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. And if he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. But know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? And the Lord said, Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom his master will set over his household and give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, My master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants, and to come and eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. And that servant will know who knew his master's will, but did not get ready or act according to his will, he will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved the beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. So those last three verses, there's some very important theological implications there, but we should go in exact order. So verses 32 to 34 are a slightly different train of thought than what comes after it. It actually fits in more with what comes before. So for context, if you look at Luke chapter 12, beginning with verse 13, most of it is about do not be preoccupied with physical possessions. So you have the parable of the rich fool, you have the man asking for his inheritance to be divided, and you have Jesus telling his followers not to be anxious about their physical provisions, which was much more pertinent back then than it is now, because we live in a time of plenty. You know, people back in ancient times could only dream of the kind of food and financial security we have today. Like even people in the bottom 20% in contemporary North American society live like kings in relation to, the upper classes of just 200 years ago. You know, even kings and queens 200 years ago did not have flat screens, smartphones, indoor plumbing, air conditioning, etc. So really, a lot of the problems that we have nowadays seem very trivial in comparison. And in fact, I would argue that I think the reason why there are so many mental health crises in the modern world today is because we have so much time to be preoccupied with higher order problems, you could say, not the lower order problems that our ancestors had to deal with. Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We don't think about those bottom tier pyramid needs so as much. We think more about the top tier pyramid needs, hence all the mental health crises. But still, the paradox is, even though we have more today, we're more anxious than ever. And the first verse of our reading tells us not to be like that. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Now, notice, it is the kingdom that God promises to us. And that's important because that's the only thing that really lasts. You can max out your 401k or your RRSP if you're Canadian. You can pay off the mortgage. You can have a lifetime supply of dental materials in your bathroom, which I kind of have. Don't ask why. But none of these things are things that we should put our trust in, because these are temporal, and when we die, we can't take them with us. The only thing that we can take with us into the next life is God's kingdom, and that's why that is the thing that God promises to us. In verse 33, it says, Sell your possessions and give to the needy, provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. Now, of course, some people will follow this literally. People who go into religious orders take a vow of poverty. So they literally do give away or sell all their possessions and live communally with their brothers and sisters. Now, in the early church, there were some people who lived that way, but that was not expected of everybody. Many Christians still held on to their possessions. But, and here is the big but, even if you hold on to your possessions, you hold to them loosely. You hold to them with an open hand. You're open to the possibility that God could at any time ask you to part with them. And even if they remain yours, you should put them at the service of other people. You know, the reason God gives you your wealth is so that you can serve him with it and so that you can serve his people with it. It's not so that you can go on yearly vacations in the Bahamas and collect seashells. In verse 34, Jesus says, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." There's a simple test to see what your fundamental orientation is, whether it's to the world or is it towards God. What do you spend most of your time and energy with? Is it worldly things? Is it vacations in the Bahamas? Or is it feeding the poor? Or, you know, going to church or volunteering for church and donating to charity? You know, where do the majority of your resources go to? When you answer that question, I can tell you what your fundamental orientation in life is. And I like to think that I fundamentally orient my life towards God and his kingdom. I know that I don't do it perfectly. I could give a lot more than I should. I could be a lot more generous. And Lord willing, I hope that as I grow in virtue, I'll become more generous. In verse 35, it says, "Stay dressed for action, keep your lamps burning." So this is where the train of thought changes now from of being less materialistic to being more vigilant of Christ's coming. So this passage is very eschatological. So eschatology is the branch of theology that deals with end times. When people think end times, they think of the book of Revelation, but the Gospels have a lot of eschatological passages as well, and this is one of them. And it actually bridges the previous section. The reason why we're not supposed to be materialistic is because all these things will come to an end. Because we're supposed to orient our lives towards the second coming. And be like men, now it's in verse 36, be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. So our life is like that of a servant whose master is away, and we are told to be vigilant because the master can come back at any moment. We don't know when he's going to come back. Back then, they did not have the kinds of messaging apps that we have now. The master is not going to send you a WhatsApp text saying, "I'll be home at around this time, so get ready." Back then, he could come back anytime. So you're supposed to live your life as though the master could come back at any time. Now, in verse 37, it says, "Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them." 37, it's very interesting. This actually overturns a bunch of expectations. Normally, the servant is supposed to stay awake so that he can serve the master when he comes back. But here, it says the servant is supposed to stay awake so that the master can serve him when he comes. Jesus is kind of shaking things up a little bit here. What do you mean the master is the one serving? Isn't the servant the one serving? Remember, Jesus said, "I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." So the paradox is that our Lord and master is also our servant. In verse 38, if he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. So in the ancient times, the night was divided into watches. The Hebrews and the Romans differed slightly. The Hebrews had divided the night into 3 watches, and the Romans divided into 4. Um, Luke seems to be going more for a Hebraic division here. So the idea is, the servants take turns staying awake. One set of servants stays awake for the first watch, another set awake for the second watch, and another for the third watch. That way, when the servant comes or master comes, there's going to be someone awake to let him in. And so it's interesting because it's specifically those servants who happen to be awake at the specific watch that the master arrives who are most blessed. Um, Now, of course, there's always that temptation for us to get a little complacent. Like, even the holiest people once in a while get a little too preoccupied with things of the world. And that's understandable. The important thing is when we catch ourselves doing it, we snap out of it right away and reorient ourselves. And in verse 4, he says, you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. The Bible has many things to say about the suddenness of God's coming, of Christ's coming, rather. Um, Anytime someone claims that they know when Jesus is going to come back, you run for the hills. You don't listen to people like that. Because Jesus is very clear that no one's supposed to know. Um, like it is futile to try to calculate the end times using whatever weird hermeneutic people come up with to interpret the Bible, when God is very clear about the futility of such actions. In verse 41, Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? So Jesus is saying this to a mixed audience. He's got his immediate circle of disciples, and then he's got the broader crowd of people, the hangers-on, who follow him around but are not necessarily committed. Um, the interesting thing is that Jesus doesn't directly answer that question. Sometimes Jesus just expects you to infer the correct answer from his statements. So he says in verse 42, who then is the faithful and wise manager whom his master will set over his household and give them their portion of food at the proper time? So we're all meant to position ourselves as the faithful and wise manager. Some cult groups have actually twisted this verse out of context as evidence for their particular cult. So the Jehovah's Witnesses love this verse because they believe that the Watchtower organization is the faithful and wise steward that gives food at the proper time. But if you read it in context, Jesus isn't talking about a specific person or a specific organization. He's talking about generally about pastors and shepherds and how they are all supposed to act as faithful and wise stewards, and they're supposed to feed their flocks. Verse 43, blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he comes. So anyone or any pastor or shepherd has the potential to be that servant. You can even generalize this to lay people. Just because you don't have holy orders doesn't mean you don't have a role to play. We all have a role to play, and we must play that role as best as we can. Verse 44, truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. So there's hints of the parable of the talents here. We all have a talent that we're given. No one is talentless. Now, a talent in that context isn't a talent as in, I can sing very well. Let me go sing in the choir. A talent is a unit of money. So everyone gets a certain measure. And some people have more than others, but everyone has something to contribute. And the reward you get isn't based on how much you contribute, it's how well you use what you've been given. So in verse 45, but if that servant says to himself, my servant is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants and to eat and drink and get drunk. And verse 46, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. So is warning us. He's going to come at an hour that a lot of people are not going to expect. This is why we don't pay attention to signs, because if the signs were that easy to tell, people would be more vigilant. But a lot of people are going to be caught with their pants down. And those people are going to wish they had been more vigilant. Because when Jesus comes, they're going to regret their complacency. And this is a warning to us because we're all tempted to become complacent. We're all tempted to think, oh, second coming is not going to happen in our lifetimes, or it's way, way into the future. Let me enjoy my life right now. That's the wrong mindset. The mindset that we should have is Jesus Christ can come tonight. We should live our lives as though Jesus Christ could come back tonight and act accordingly. We should serve him as though the second coming was tonight. And now the last two verses, I want to talk about this because it's very important for our theology. And that servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. What this tells us is that there are degrees of judgment and degrees of punishment at the last judgment. Some people will be judged more severely. Some people will receive a harsher sentence than others. And the sentence or the judgment isn't based on how bad you were. Funny enough, that's the misconception a lot of people have, which is that, a mass murderer is going to be judged more severely than a porn addict, because as bad as porn addiction is, that's nowhere near as bad as mass murder. But the mass murderer might be less cognizant of his actions. They might not have heard the gospel. They might not have had Christian influences in their lives to tell them what they're doing is wrong, whereas the porn addict might. So the basis of the judgment is not how bad you acted. The basis of the judgment is how much did you know? Like, how much light did you receive? Think about when Jesus tells the people of Capernaum and Bethsaida and Chorazin that they'll be judged more severely than the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. That doesn't mean that they were doing worse sins than the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Compared to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, they must have been fine, upstanding citizens. They might have seemed like deeply religious, devout people from our perspective. The problem was they rejected Christ. They heard the gospel preached to them. And because of that, they had more to be accountable to. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah didn't hear Jesus preaching to them. It's the same with us in the present context. This is why we believe in invincible ignorance. Some people, they just don't know. Or they might be in a position where they couldn't know because there's no one to tell them. Those people will not be judged as severely as those who hear the gospel and consciously reject it, which is why, if you're a non-Catholic and you have access to a Catholic church, you have access to Catholic resources, you can know about the faith, you are in a dangerous position because you're not invincibly ignorant. You can know about the truth. And you are responsible for what you do with that access. And, if we're Catholic and we have non-Catholics in our lives, that means the Catholics in our lives are probably not invincibly ignorant either. I'm not saying they definitively aren't, but we should not assume that they are. We should live our lives as though every person around us is culpable, and we should evangelize them accordingly. And that's how we avoid indifferentism. Just because there is the theoretical possibility that someone can be saved outside the church doesn't mean that we should take that for granted of any unbeliever that we know. We should preach the gospel to everyone. We should tell them, warn them that Jesus is coming and he is going to save his people. And if you want to be saved, you need to be part of his people and you need to live accordingly. You can't be a lukewarm Catholic. Just because you're baptized and go to mass doesn't mean you're going to go to heaven. You actually have to let that sacramental grace uh, transform your entire life so that your fundamental orientation is towards the kingdom of God. And that is the end of the Bible study. Hopefully, that gave you a lot of food for thought. And hopefully, that will deepen your appreciation for the readings when you go to Mass. If you know anyone who is a priest or a deacon or a catechist, share this with them. Hopefully, this will bless them and help them to prepare their homilies more efficiently. And if this blesses you, be sure to support me on Patreon because, the resources that I use to prepare for these, they do require money and your investment will help improve the quality of these studies. So thank you very much for following along and let me know what you think in the comment section. I look forward to hearing from you guys and see you next time.